Hello, I am Brian Mansbridge. I'm an ex-naval officer. I spent 30 years in the Navy, nearly spent 30 years out of the Navy, of which I was a non-executive of the NHS and did lots of other things, including taking a narrowboat around the country. But how about the connection with Lee? Well, I first came to Lee after I'd been at sea for a long time and I was looking for a shore job. And I realised I could become a hovercraft pilot and do some trials with mine warfare, since they were doing hovercraft trials in mine warfare. And so I came to Lee, became a hovercraft pilot, and had a very nice shore job. It also took me overseas as well, which I was keen to do, because there was an accident in Hong Kong with a hovercraft. There was a decision by the Naval Board of Inquiry to say that only seamen officers could operate hovercraft in Hong Kong because of the congested waters. And so I was off as a young naval officer to Hong Kong in a hurry, like tomorrow was the request. I do response for plannings for both the Lee Residents Association and also the Gosport Society. And as well as I went as a volunteer for a time back to the Hovercraft Museum. Although I'm not an engineer, I took part in looking after the hovercrafters, leading in the engineering team. So we did a lot of work on trying to keep some of the hovercraft running, keep them watertight, and develop the museum, which was a very volunteer-led organisation running on a shoestring. Still is, but hopefully what's happening with the waterfront development will see that Hovercraft Museum as the only one of its type internationally recognised to become a proper feature for Lee and to complement actually the wider military interests that are focused on this part of the world, with the submarine museum and the diving museum, both this side of the water, and of course the naval base and the Royal Museum for the Royal Navy in Portsmouth Dockyard. What was the role of Daedalus in Lee? Well, it's a very significant role. Without going too much into the history of Lee, the Robinson family founded Lee as a Victorian new town, as a resort town, really with their idea to compete with Bournemouth or Southsea. And they built some very fine mansions on the seafront, of which one still is in what was HMS Daedalus, Westcliff House on the seafront. And that is an example of the sort of houses they started to build. But they divided the whole of Lee up into plots, which were generous plots, and there were rules about how much you would have to pay to build a house in Lee. So they were very keen that it should be an upmarket resort. And most of the people that lived there in those early days could afford to have servants to go to Fareham for shopping, which was a day's event, and a long hike in a horse and cart. If they could, there wasn't any public transport. So what did Daedalus do for Lee? Well, in the First World War, the submarine patrols were run by seaplanes from call shot, but the First World War demands filled call shot, and there was no training ability, so they looked around and found a site on Lee and actually took requisition for the First World War the site that it now is well, most people know it's the Hovercraft Museum and Slipway, but behind it was Daedalus. At the end of the First World War, the site was still held on by the military, now behind a fence, and it took most of West Lee beyond the church and developed it as a military base. Between the wars, the military held on to it for training, mainly for the Royal Naval Flying Corps, and it was held on, and then the RAF took it over and operated it between wars. And in fact, the wardroom, which most people call it, is a RAF mess, as are some of the buildings behind. And they took it on and expanded naturally with their airplanes with wheels on to take on more land behind the seafront. And that is the extent of the airfield that we now know is Solent Airport. So now you have both a seafront base and also an airfield behind, which still exists today. So now a lot more of Lee went behind the wire, and West West Lee became very much a military focus. Then we went into the Second World War, and of course it became a very important air base. And the Navy ran a lot of flights for coastal maritime patrols from Lee, and for D-Day, Lee Airfield was the busiest in the Second World War. So there was even more interest in Lee, and more people came in. And after the Second World War, the Navy hung on to Lee as HMS Daedalus, which is the name that most people will recognise in Lee and Gosport. It also became the air engineering base and the headquarters of Flag Officer Naval Air Command. So there was a lot of naval interest in Lee and a lot of continued expansion of the site. And hence we have what the waterfront site is now quite a big base camp, as it was. Still behind the wire, still taking most of West Lee. But then along came jet aircraft, and unfortunately the runway was a bit too short for jet aircraft. Wasn't that fortunate for the residents of Lee? Because Lee was then the communications flight for the Navy, and then helicopters came here, and the engineering continued until the Flag Officer Naval Air Command moved to Yeovilton. But that was really when Lee began, Daedalus and Lee sort of saw a change, and the air base as we closed was closed, and we were left with a semi-derelict military site, still behind the wire, and it still had a big impact on Lee. So the story then, there was this period of what to do with this large area of land, which was West Lee, as I'd call it. There was even a threat to turn it into a gravel extraction area, which was actually campaigned against by the locals. And there was an early bid for an immigration holding camp there, and that was also vigorously campaigned against by the locals. And the airfield went through several iterations under various authorities, like South East Development Authority, I think it was called. But apart from still running its SAR helicopters from there, and a police flight at one stage, and minor use by small aircraft, and also the Royal Naval Gliding Club, it really wasn't in, the airfield wasn't in much use, and certainly the waterfront, as we now know, the development site, was falling into dereliction, sadly. Now we have proposed developments of the waterfront, which I'm really pleased to see, because there are some really good buildings. We are lucky that Westcliff House, which is one of the original mansion houses built on the seafront, was used for officers' accommodation, and so it was maintained by the Navy over the years and still is the most original of the seafront houses. Another thing that perhaps as part of that change was the Schneider Trophy races of the 20s. That brought, because Lee at that stage still had a railway line, or they ran an extra trains for that, that brought more people into Lee. More of local people came in, as well as people with their motor cars, and there's some lovely pictures of motor cars on Lee cliff top, with picnics all spread out, and all local people on the beach with their umbrellas watching the Schneider Trophy races. So that brought a lot of people into Lee, and maybe that was part of the influence of people thinking, oh, that's not a bad place, and might come here and retire. And so there has been quite an infill of those plots of Lee. So in the development of Lee, you can see, if you look around, you'll see different houses of different periods. Very eclectic changes in the character of Lee. We have Art Deco houses in Millville Road, which were built in the 30s, and some of the shops and the centre were built in that style. But not everyone wanted modern flat roofs, so there are plenty of pitch roofs and traditional characters. And then, of course, you've got the original houses on the seafront, which we only got one left, which was behind the Navy wire. Right, today, the Waterfront Development Company is going to redevelop Lee, and they're also, I'm very encouraged by this, going to try and keep the Hovercraft Museum as a museum for the future. And that's really important because the Hovercraft Museum, the invention Sir Christopher Cockerell came up with was pioneered on the Solent. Daedalus was really important in the hovercraft story because they had a slipway which was originally designed for seaplanes, and that was obviously an ideal place for the military to try hovercraft. It's so good that we can keep the history of the hovercraft here in Lee, and it's important because there out on the site are representatives of all the hovercraft that from the early days of trials hovercraft, experimental hovercraft, to the early military examples, the SRN-6, and of course the SRN-6 or its modern derivatives are used across Solent, whereas the bigger ones that went across Channel have really suffered from the cost of running them compared with ferries and aircraft. But the examples are all there in the Hovercraft Museum, as well as all the archives from the development of hovercraft. And there's a fantastic resource, which I'm sure would be a reference for people. Well, because of my long interest in the architecture and the character of a place, which I suppose, I don't know where I've inherited that from, but it's just so good to see the place being reused. And also to see West Lee join up the wire. There's no reason for the military wire to be there, to be fenced off. It has been fenced off for a lot of years because there was obviously the risk of vandalism and to preserve the site, but that's not the ultimate aim. The site is to reuse it, to be useful and to join it back up with Lee, both residential and employment. It's the perfect solution.